Morning broke over Ouagadougou with the weight of uncertainty pressing down like a storm cloud. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who had carried the burden of a nation on his shoulders, rose with the usual heaviness that came from knowing that every sunrise brought new betrayals, new battles, and new silent enemies. But today, the whispers were louder. Reports had reached his desk overnight, reports that made no sense, reports so absurd that his instinct told him they were lies, planted by the IMF to disorient him. A woman, a billionaire, and a project so colossal, so ambitious, that it defied imagination. They said she was building Africa's largest rice processing plant, right here, in Burkina Faso. Traoré dismissed it at first. How could such a thing be true? No African billionaire would move against the global order without foreign permission. And yet, the rumors spread like wildfire, igniting the hopes of the poor and the fears of the powerful. The IMF's claws had long fed on Africa's hunger. The French conglomerates made fortunes by selling overpriced imported grain. And now, a single woman, cloaked in mystery, hidden in shadows, threatened to shatter their monopoly. The captain sat in silence, the reports crumpled in his fist, his jaw tight. He did not believe. He could not believe. And yet, beneath the doubt, a question gnawed at him. What if it was true? If it was true, it meant salvation. If it was true, it meant war. And in the end, when the truth revealed itself, even Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had defied empires and stared down armies, stood in shock. To understand the weight of that rumor of a female billionaire constructing Africa's largest rice plant, one must first enter the reality of Burkina Faso, a land where history itself felt like chains dragging through the dust. For centuries, the soil had been fertile, the rivers alive, the people resilient. Yet in every generation, hunger returned like a ghost no one could exorcise. This was not fate, it was design, a careful architecture of dependence. The International Monetary Fund, with its contracts written in sterile ink, dictated every grain that left or entered the country. Foreign companies, draped in polished suits, shipped in sacks of imported rice stamped with foreign flags, mocking the farmers who bent their backs in Burkina Faso's fields. Subsidies for local farmers. Forbidden. Credit for agricultural expansion. Crushed under debt traps. It was a quiet war, a war fought not with bullets, but with hunger. Traoré had seen it with his own eyes. He had walked into villages where children's hair turned orange from malnutrition. He had spoken to mothers who had sold their last goats for a handful of rice. He had seen soldiers, proud men who had sworn to defend their country, split a single bowl of millet between four, their bellies grumbling even as they stood guard at night. And he knew. Hunger was not poverty. Hunger was a weapon. It was the perfect weapon, because it could make a nation kneel without firing a single shot. This was why the rumor pierced so deeply. A rice plant, Africa's largest, in Burkina Faso. If true, it was more than an economic project. It was a revolution. But revolutions had enemies, and Traoré knew his. Inside the gilded halls of government, 3 ministers, once his closest allies, whispered into telephones late at night. They met with foreign ambassadors behind closed doors. They smiled at him in daylight, but sharpened knives in the dark. He had suspected their betrayal for months, but proof had always slipped through his fingers like sand. Now, with the rumor of the billionaire's project, their behavior grew frantic. Reports reached him of midnight meetings in the French embassy, of secret bank transfers flowing into accounts in Switzerland, of hushed arguments over who would control the billionaire's arrival. Were they planning to welcome her, or to destroy her? Traoré could not yet tell. And then there was her, the mysterious woman who had become a ghostly figure haunting the corridors of power. No one could agree on her name. Some called her Awa. Others swore her name was Mariam. Still others whispered a title instead of a name. La Reine Cachée, the Hidden Queen. Her origins were no less uncertain. In the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, women selling vegetables swore she was the daughter of a peasant, a girl who had left the country at 14 and returned a billionaire. In military circles, officers whispered she was a spy, a French asset designed to infiltrate the captain's fragile regime. And in the remote villages, griots told stories of her as Sankara's reincarnation, a spirit sent back in female form to complete his unfinished revolution. 3 stories, 3 masks, and yet not one revealed her truth. What was undeniable, however, was the evidence. Satellite images showed massive land being cleared. Roads were being built in silence, hidden from public eyes. Heavy machinery had crossed the borders in convoys marked as foreign aid. Workers were sworn to secrecy, their mouths sealed with contracts and threats, and beneath it all the foundations of something vast, a factory the size of a city. Block were being laid brick by brick. The IMF, of course, noticed. In Paris, the boardrooms filled with panic. The French grain companies, long accustomed to feeding off Africa's dependency, saw their empire trembling. "If this project succeeds," one CEO hissed, "our market collapses overnight." In Washington, IMF officials sharpened their language. Unauthorized infrastructure project, they called it. Violation of debt agreements. Behind the sterile words lay the real threat. Sanctions, embargoes, economic strangulation. But here, in Burkina Faso, the rumor grew into a storm. In the villages, farmers prayed with tears in their eyes. "If she is real, our children will never starve." Again, they whispered. In the capital, young men marched at night chanting her name, though none could prove what it was. In the army barracks, soldiers debated whether to defend her or destroy her, and at the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, torn between disbelief and hope, between suspicion and longing. He remembered the last time hope had risen like this. It was when he had spoken openly about sovereignty, about kicking out the French military bases, about reclaiming Burkina Faso's gold. Back then, the people had cheered him like a prophet, but the betrayal that followed, the sanctions, the assassinations, the generals who turned against him, had scarred him so deeply that he no longer trusted hope. Hope, he had learned, could be poison. And yet, he could not ignore it. If this woman was real, if her factory was real, if her intentions were true, then it meant something greater than a single project. It meant an African billionaire was defying the West not with speeches but with rice. It meant a woman was building freedom where men had failed. It meant Burkina Faso might finally escape. Hunger's chains. But every revolution carries a cost. And as Traoré studied the crumpled report in his hand, he knew. If this woman's project was true, then blood would follow. The IMF would not allow it. The corporations would not allow it. And the traitors within his own walls would not allow it. Somewhere in the silence of his office, the clock ticked toward war. For days, Traoré tried to uncover the truth. He sent trusted officers in plain clothes to scout the reported location. He interrogated ministers with polite questions, listening not to their words, but to their silences. He read intelligence reports with bloodshot eyes, searching for a trace, a clue, a slip. And then, one night, just before dawn, the first confirmation arrived. His men returned with photographs, grainy, taken from the distance, but undeniable. Machinery, walls rising, workers moving in coordinated shifts. The rice plant was real, and with that revelation came a second. She was coming. The mysterious billionaire, the hidden queen, was already on her way to Burkina Faso. The ministers prepared a grand reception. The IMF prepared sanctions. The corporations prepared sabotage, and Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who had sworn to protect his people, prepared for the most dangerous confrontation of his life. Because he knew one thing with certainty. If she succeeded, Africa would rise. If she failed, Burkina Faso would burn. The city of Ouagadougou had never seen such a spectacle. The billionaire's arrival was supposed to be a celebration, but it felt more like a funeral dressed in gold. Soldiers lined the streets, people cheered with desperation, and yet in the shadows, whispers carried like smoke. They will not let this factory live. From the moment she set foot in Burkina Faso, forces unseen began to circle her like vultures. It happened only days after her landing. A warehouse filled with imported machinery destined for the rice plant burst into flames in the dead of night. The fire tore through steel and concrete, lighting up the horizon in a hellish glow. By dawn, nothing remained but twisted iron and ashes. Traoré stood in the wreckage, his boots sinking into blackened soil, his fists trembling. Around him, villagers wept, not just for the dead workers, but for the dream they had already begun to believe in. His generals approached, their faces masks of solemnity, but in their eyes flickered something else, satisfaction. "They want her gone before she even begins," Traoré muttered, "and they will burn this country to the ground to stop her." The IMF's answer came swiftly. Within weeks, trade routes were severed. Burkina Faso's currency plummeted. Essential imports, fuel, medicine, grain, vanished from shelves. Mothers queued for hours at bakeries only to walk away with nothing. Hunger gnawed at the capital. And yet, instead of breaking her resolve, the crisis seemed to harden the billionaire. "I will fund the plant in cash," she told Traoré in a late-night meeting, her voice low, defiant. "No banks, no loans, no foreign hands. If they close one border, we will open another. If they burn one warehouse, we will build two." For the first time in months, Traoré felt something stir inside him. Not the burden of leadership, but the faintest spark of hope. Still, he could not ignore the shadows gathering around him. 3 of his most trusted ministers had grown unusually quiet. Once loud in their support, they now offered excuses, delays, doubts. At first, Traoré told himself it was fear. But soon, reports began to trickle in. Secret meetings at a French-owned hotel, hidden accounts swelling in offshore banks, conversations about restoring order whispered in foreign tongues. The betrayal was no longer rumor. It was fact. And yet, Traoré held back. He needed proof, not suspicion. The wrong move could fracture his government and doom the rice project before it even began. So he waited. He watched. And every night, the tension inside the palace grew like a tightening noose. While leaders schemed, the people began to rise. Farmers abandoned their fields to march into the capital, chanting the billionaire's name alongside Traoré's. They carried baskets of raw rice, holding them high as symbols of what could come, a future without hunger. Children drew pictures of the plant in chalk across the streets. Old men lifted their fists in solidarity. For the first time since Sankara, hope was no longer whispered in secret. It was shouted in the open. But hope is dangerous. Hope threatens empires. And soon it would cost blood. One evening, as construction pushed forward despite sanctions, a convoy carrying engineers was ambushed on a dusty road. The vehicles were riddled with bullets, glass shattering, wheels tearing against the gravel. By the time reinforcements arrived, the convoy was nothing but corpses and silence. Among the dead were men and women who had come not for profit, but for belief in the project. When news spread, Ouagadougou exploded in grief. Funerals turned into protests. Protest turned into rage. Crowds filled the streets demanding justice, demanding answers, demanding that Traoré protect not only the billionaire, but their dream. And in the palace, the walls closed tighter. Through it all, the billionaire remained calm, almost too calm. Rumors began to swirl about her past. Some whispered she had once been an exile, stripped of her wealth by French corporations, and had rebuilt herself in silence, far from the eyes of the West. Others said she was backed by a secret African consortium, a shadowy alliance of businessmen who wanted to topple foreign control. But one rumor haunted Traoré most of all, that she had once been betrayed, and was now using Burkina Faso not only to build a factory, but to settle an old score. He asked her once, quietly, as they stood overlooking the half-built plant, "Why risk everything for us? Why here?" Her answer was a whisper carried by the wind. "Because this is where the chain breaks." By the third month, Ouagadougou was a city on edge. The people starved under sanctions. Sabotage claimed lives weekly. The billionaire worked tirelessly, pouring her fortune into the ground, defying every attempt to kill the dream. And Traoré found himself surrounded by shadows, unsure who was ally, who was traitor. Late one night, as he sat alone in his war room, a message slid beneath his door. No signature, no seal, just one line written in a trembling hand. "They are not coming for her. They are coming for you." And with that, the stage was set. The rice plant, the billionaire, the government itself, everything now balanced on a knife's edge. The world watched. The people prayed. And Traoré braced himself for the storm that was about to break. The storm began not with thunder, but with silence. For 3 nights, Ouagadougou seemed to hold its breath. The sabotage stopped. No fires, no assassinations, no whispers in the dark. Even the markets were quiet, the usual chaos subdued into uneasy calm. Traoré knew it was not peace, it was preparation, the silence before the strike. On the 4th night it came. Explosions ripped through the city's power grid, plunging entire districts into darkness. Gunfire followed, sporadic at first, then swelling into waves that rolled closer to the capital's heart. Traoré stood at the palace balcony, the night air thick with smoke, the horizon alive with flashes of orange. Reports screamed through the radios. Armed militias, faces covered, weapons foreign, advancing toward the city from 3 directions. They moved with precision. This was no uprising. It was a coordinated attempt to end everything. By dawn, the plant construction site was under siege. Traoré raced there with his soldiers, the billionaire by his side despite his protests. She refused to be hidden. "If they burn this place," she said, eyes steady, "they burn the soul of Africa, and I will not watch it from behind a wall." Together they arrived at the gates, and what they saw froze them. Dozens of trucks surrounded the site, men with rifles shouting orders, trying to breach the unfinished perimeter. Workers, unarmed but defiant, had locked themselves inside, forming human barricades with their own bodies. Old women clutched hoes, young boys threw stones, engineers gripped steel rods like spears. Against all reason, they resisted. The clash that followed was chaos made flesh. Traoré's soldiers charged, the ground trembling beneath their boots. The militias opened fire. Bullets tore through dust and cries, the air filled with screams, with smoke, with the iron scent of blood. Yet the people did not scatter. Farmers, who had come to see their rice plant rise, now fought to defend it, standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers. And through it all, Traoré moved like a man possessed, rallying his men, dragging the wounded to safety, standing tall where others fell. But the militias kept coming. Wave after wave, their numbers seemed endless. It was then, in the chaos, that Traoré saw him, one of his own ministers, standing atop a captured truck shouting commands to the attackers. The betrayal that had haunted him was no longer hidden. It was there, in the open, bathed in gunfire and smoke. For a moment, time slowed. Their eyes met. And in that single look, everything became clear. The hunger, the sabotage, the flames, all of it had been orchestrated from within. Rage unlike anything he had ever known surged through Traoré. He gave the order himself, his voice breaking the night like thunder. "Take him alive!" Soldiers surged forward. The minister tried to flee, but fate had already written the ending. A single shot struck his leg, dropping him into the dust. His screams vanished beneath the roar of the battle. The traitor was dragged away, and with him, the illusion of division shattered. His capture ignited the soldiers. The people roared. Something primal took hold of the defenders, and they pushed forward with fury. The billionaire stood amidst it all, her face lit by fire, her clothes torn but her eyes unyielding. At one point, she lifted a megaphone and shouted to the crowd, her voice carrying through the chaos. "This land belongs to you, not them. Defend it." Her words struck like lightning. Farmers, children, women, they surged against the attackers, outnumbered but unstoppable, wielding nothing but courage and rage. The battle stretched into hours. By midday, the militias broke. Their lines shattered, their trucks abandoned, their leaders fled into the bush. Smoke rose over Ouagadougou, but the plant still stood. Blood stained its half-built walls, but it was unbroken. Against impossible odds, the people had defended not just concrete and steel, but the fragile hope it represented. When silence finally fell, Traoré collapsed to his knees, his uniform torn, his body heavy with exhaustion. Around him, the dead were being carried, their faces covered with cloth. Mothers wept, soldiers groaned, but amidst the grief was something else. Pride. They had not lost. They had endured. The billionaire walked slowly to his side, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Now," she whispered, her voice rough but steady. "The world will see. They tried to kill it, and still it breathes." Traoré lifted his gaze to the sky, darkened with smoke but glowing faintly with the sun breaking through. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps this was not just a battle won. Perhaps it was the turning point. But deep down, he knew it was not over. The IMF would not forgive humiliation. The traitors had not all been unmasked. Shadows still lingered in the corridors of power. The rice plant stood, yes, but it was now more than a factory. It was a target, a symbol too dangerous for the world to ignore. And as cheers began to rise from the surviving crowd, Ibrahim Traoré's heart carried both triumph and dread. The storm had broken, but the war for Burkina Faso's future was only beginning. The city smelled of smoke and iron. For days after the battle, Ouagadougou was wrapped in the heavy silence of mourning. The streets bore the scars of fire, bullet holes pockmarked walls, blackened trucks rusted where they had burned. Families dug shallow graves, their tears mixing with dust. The rice plant's unfinished frame stood in the distance like a wounded giant, scarred but upright, defiant against the sky. Ibrahim Traoré walked among his people, his boots sinking into ash and earth, his face carved with exhaustion. Soldiers saluted him, but there was no victory in their eyes, only grief. Mothers clutched his arms, weeping, asking why their sons had to die. Children stared at him, as though searching for answers he did not have. And though he stood tall, inside he carried the weight of every loss. The captured minister was dragged before the nation. His face, once polished with arrogance, was now swollen with bruises. When the truth spilled from his lips, the country trembled. He had taken bribes, opened doors for foreign mercenaries, sold coordinates of supply lines. The betrayal had reached deeper than anyone imagined, and behind him, like vultures circling above, foreign hands had pulled the strings. Corporations, banks, and men in suits thousands of miles away had seen Burkina Faso not as a nation, but as prey. The revelations spread like wildfire. Crowds filled the streets, not with rage, but with a strange, fierce unity. Women drummed in marketplaces, men raised their hoes and machetes like banners, children painted the walls with slogans. This is our land. This is our fight. The betrayal that should have broken them instead bound them tighter. The billionaire did not leave. She refused to return to her fortress of wealth. Instead, she lived among the people, her bodyguards reduced, her face bare, of luxury. She moved through the camps of the wounded, bringing food, money, medicine. To the people, she was no longer just a billionaire. She was a mother who had chosen her children, not her fortune. And when she stood beside Traoré, the image of the two, a soldier of the soil and a woman of wealth, became a vision of a new kind of Africa. The world watched in disbelief. International channels framed the uprising as chaos, as rebellion, as instability. But the footage leaking from ordinary phones told another story. Farmers standing before tanks, women shielding children with their bodies, soldiers bleeding as they refused to retreat. In the heart of it all, Ibrahim Traoré stood like a mountain, carrying both sorrow and defiance. His image spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, across Africa, across the diaspora, across the globe. In Senegal, students marched with his name on banners. In Nigeria, mothers invoked him in prayers for their sons. In Congo, miners whispered his story underground, their lamps flickering in the dark. Even in the West, among immigrants working in kitchens and factories, the tale of Burkina Faso's resistance stirred something ancient, the dream of freedom. The IMF convened in silence. Their statement spoke of regional instability and risks to investment, but behind closed doors, their fear was raw. A nation so small, so poor, had stood against their sanctions, their puppets, their mercenaries, and survived. If Burkina Faso could endure, what stopped others from rising? The rice plant became more than a project. It became a pilgrimage site. Workers from distant villages walked for days to see it, to touch its walls, to swear oaths upon its soil. They called it the House of Grain, and mothers whispered to their children that one day no African child would go hungry because of it. Construction resumed with greater speed, not because of foreign contracts, but because ordinary people brought what little they had. Bags of cement carried on donkey carts, timber hauled from distant forests, coins collected in jars. It was no longer her plant, nor his plant. It belonged to them all. Yet for Traoré, the nights were not peaceful. He lay awake, haunted by faces he could not save. He remembered the children killed in schools, the soldiers who died clutching rifles, too old for their hands, the farmers whose hunger had driven them to rebellion. Their ghosts lingered in his silence. He wondered if he had the strength to carry what was now expected of him, for he was no longer just a captain, no longer just a president. He had become something heavier, a symbol, and symbols do not rest on. The day the plant's first machines roared to life, the entire nation gathered. Drums beat from dawn until dusk. Women ululated until their voices broke. Old men wept openly. Grain poured like gold from steel chutes, and the air filled with the scent of hope. Traoré stood before the crowd, not with a speech prepared, but with his heart bared. His voice was raw, trembling, yet unshakable. "They wanted us hungry," he said, his words carried by the wind. "They wanted us silent. They wanted us broken. But we are still here. And as long as this land gives us rice, as long as our people stand together, no empire, no bank, no traitor can chain us again." The cheers were not just loud. They were primal, like the earth itself roaring. And in that moment, it was clear. Something irreversible had happened. A spark had been lit. A fire that could not be contained within borders. Across Africa, leaders whispered in fear, while their people whispered in hope. Could this be the beginning? Could this be the moment the continent, long scarred by exploitation, finally began to rise? Traoré looked to the horizon as the crowd carried him on their shoulders, his face streaked with sweat and dust. He did not smile, but his eyes burned with something fierce, something unbreakable. The weight of his people pressed upon him, yet so did their love. And as the sun dipped behind the plant, painting the sky in gold and crimson, one question lingered. Not just in Burkina Faso, but across the world. Was this the day Africa began to break its chains?